the future of crypto is very, very bright if you fundamentally enable people to do things on chain that they simply could not do off chain.
Hey everybody, Tanner here with WAGMI Ventures. On today's episode, we have Omar Yehia, Head of Investments at Matter Labs, the creators of zkSync. For anyone who's new, this is the WAGMI Ventures podcast where we do snapshots with interesting founders from across Web3. Check out wagmiventures.io to learn more about the syndicate behind the podcast. But for now, let's get into it with Omar from Matter Labs. All right, hey everybody, I'm here today with Omar Yehia, Head of Investments at Matter Labs. Omar, how's it going today?
Oh, excellent. Good to be here. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing good, man. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm really excited to talk. And the work you guys are doing at Matter Labs is pretty remarkable. And, we're going to dive in on all that. But here, maybe to start, I'd love to hear a little bit about your background and how you ended up as Head of Investments at Matter Labs.
So a long time ago, my background was actually in applied maths. Somehow I ended up at a hedge fund where we did all sorts of things. There's a liquid book, there was a late stage venture, early stage venture. I was really excited about the early stage venture parts of the book because that's where I could sort of sit on both sides and deal with the operators on one side, the founders, but then also on the investment side. And the technical component, my background was in research as well. And so I got really excited about sort of getting my hands dirty. And the more time I spent there, the more time I realized I wanted to spend as much time near that boundary. And that meant that early stage, particularly pre-seed and seed investing, was very exciting to me. But also I had the great privilege of working with a lot of founders that were very receptive to feedback and ideation. And just through basic whiteboarding sessions, we could get a lot of the ideas that I or some of my collaborators had in mind. You could see these, the 8 weeks later, 10 weeks later, become part of a product stack and ultimately end up in the hands of thousands or 10,000s of people. So I thought all of that was really exciting. In the crypto space, I was around since the ICO era, probably just before the ICO era. And I sort of got a Cliff Notes version of how do you do investing in a market where your investment becomes liquid, not years later, but months or weeks later. And it occurred to me that this is a very sort of different paradigm because in many ways, you're invested in something that's pre-revenue, many times pre-product, and yet your claim on whatever that thing is, whatever network or protocol or whatever, was sort of liquid. And so you had to think about not only how do you value these things, but also how their valuation framework differs from sort of traditional equity and what does it mean for a protocol to have a token, and the company behind the protocol, well, how do you value that? Or if there's no value sort of capture there, how do you value the token? All these sort of ideas. So it got me really excited about the space in general. And it occurred to me that the most important roadmaps in the space or the milestones that are going to enable widespread adoption are the ones that are ultimately going to anchor whatever long-term monetary value is sort of captured by this ecosystem. So I was cautious in investing in, or even, dabbling in sort of all things built on top of L1s just for the sake of being built on top of L1s, this idea of let's just digitize everything and then try and put it on blockchain. I was very suspicious of that idea. But I was very curious about what are the anchor points that are going to enable sort of widespread adoption, if at all. And my hypothesis was there was going to be a lot of value capture around those points. I didn't know how or in what capacity. But what I did know is that one had to really understand the technical intricacies of these things if one were to have a meaningful punt or a meaningful bet on these things. And because a lot of it from the outside or from 30,000 foot level sort of sounds the same, when we talk about different consensus mechanisms, or we talk about different scaling solutions, or we talk about different types of tokenomics or different types of civil mechanisms, all of these things to the uninitiated, they sort of sound very similar. And so the question is, well, how do you make informed bets? And bets is the proper terminology. And I understood the need to spend a lot of time really understanding the sort of technical nuances. And in doing so, it occurred to me that the scaling problem is basically the next generation problem in all of crypto. The first generation or the zeroth order problem was Byzantine fault tolerance. And how do you have basically peer-to-peer cash in a global secure distributed way, and what were the implications of the sort of cap theorem and all of this. And then once that was sort of established, and I say sort of because I still think we're in the midst of the first great experiment, the Bitcoin experiment, because we don't know how the ultimate economics of the Bitcoin network are going to be cast. I think there were certain engineering decisions that were made 10 years ago that we're still sort of suffering through the consequences. And I don't mean suffering in a negative position. I mean, there are repercussions that we have to sort of understand. We're still through that. I would call that sort of generation one. Generation two is, okay, let's assume that this succeeds in some capacity. How on earth do we get hundreds of millions of people to use these networks, and if it's going to be useful at all? And to answer that question, you literally need the ability for hundreds of millions of people to actually be able to use the network in a non-trivial way, but in a way that's cheap. And we know that there is a cost to that because that is the trade-off that we made. When you wanted to build a permissionless, decentralized, and most importantly, censorship-resistant network, there is an economic cost to that, and there's a computational cost to that. So the idea is, well, how do you preserve these elements while reducing the computational burden? So there were a few different avenues of scaling. Consensus was one of them. Off-chain compute was another. Hardware scaling was another. And I was really, really interested in the off-chain compute version, which in my mind was the second instance of a new computational paradigm, the first being programmable compute. This idea that there are different smart contracts that are immutable in their own ways, that they sort of interact with each other, and money and value, more importantly, can transfer in between each other, and people can sort of build on top of these financial stacks. The second paradigm was, how do we move a lot of these calculations off chain and thereby reducing the computational burden, but without giving up what we intended to do in the first place, which is decentralization, censorship resistance. So in came what is known as the sort of ZK or zero knowledge technologies. Of course, people sort of refer to them as that, but really when we are interested in the scaling problem, we're really talking about the use of validity proofs, which just means that somebody goes off chain without interacting with the network in a synchronous way necessarily, and then does a computation. And then after they're done with that computation, they wrap it in a sort of mathematical proof. They can present a very short and succinct proof to the network saying that I actually did a set of calculations correctly. And here's a mathematical guarantee. You don't have to trust me. And then this is the sort of ingredient list of how you need to update your state based on this. These are called validity proofs, but people sort of use the word interchangeably with zero knowledge proofs. I thought this was going to be the path forward. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about how do we invest in companies that are building or using that technology. So there are two types of companies in my mind, or two types of primitives, really, companies building those primitives. The first type of primitive is the primitive that benefits from a cheap computational environment on a decentralized network. And the other, which I thought was much more interesting, was the primitives that enable that environment. That's why I spent the last couple of years focusing on that. And at some point, I had met the folks at Mata Labs, the people that brought you zkSync, zk Porter, and a lot of other wonderful things. And we realized we all sort of shared the same philosophy, and both on the investment side and obviously on the technological side. And we started thinking about how we sort of do this together. And the more we talked to each other, the more we sort of liked each other. And we realized that we can sort of join forces. And so now here we are. As I joined as the head of investments in order to try and deploy our balance sheet as well as grow the zkSync ecosystem in a manner that's befitting of something that promises to be the scaling solution for the Ethereum ecosystem as a whole.
Really comprehensive, kind of not only your background, but also how you think about the path that brought you to where you are now and what you're up to now. So really, really helpful. I'd love to jump into the work itself. So just to tee us up, can you maybe share a little bit how zkSync specifically has evolved from testnet to mainnet alpha today? Just a little bit of the history and some of the exciting stuff that's happening right now with zkSync in terms of traction and progress?
Certainly. So just to anchor some timelines, Era mainnet, which is the current version, has been live since mid-March, or since the first week or second week of March, and has, for all intents and purposes, been performing quite well. And we've had, I think, at this point, almost $200 million of collateral on the network. We've had millions of users interact, as well as multiple millions of fees, obviously. And so far, the entire architectural set has been working quite well. The prover design, the sequencer, they're all being informed by the types of transactions that go onto the network. The first public instance, which was sort of like a closed alpha in a sense that it was public, but the access was mostly to the team itself. We were deploying a lot of contracts, moving to different edges of the network from a computational perspective, and trying to see basically if there was any gaping hole in the design. And I think that was zkSync Lite spent more than a year sort of doing so. And when we were confident that we basically covered every possible avenue, we were satisfied that it was secure enough for people to actually use that collateral and bridge onto the network. And slowly and surely, we've been seeing just an enormous amount of activity, people bridging on to the network, lots of different projects deploying on the network, beginning to explore lots of the different features that we have on zkSync that are actually not, and this is very important, it's not a replica of the Ethereum virtual machine. It is something that is very similar to the Ethereum virtual machine with some improvements. That part of the design trade-off is that if you wanted to replicate the Ethereum virtual machine in every single way, and in every, there are different sort of classifications for that. But if you wanted to do so, this would be very computationally burdensome, and you probably wouldn't benefit much by trying to rewrite everything using circuits. So instead, you had to make it a little bit more friendly. You just had to take a look in the past and think about how the design decisions were made for the Ethereum virtual machine when it began with. And you had to think about it from first principles and decide, okay, these were decisions that were made at this time in order to try and meet constraints A, B, and C. Now that we're in this environment, we no longer are constrained exactly by these constraints, but maybe by a more subtle set of constraints. So how do we sort of move from one constraint to another constraint while providing a lot of computational efficiency and reducing the execution costs, but still maintaining an extremely similar development environment so that you basically can take whatever that you had from your layer one and for all intents and purposes, with the very minor modifications deployed on the layer two. So this was the very fine line that sort of we had to walk.
Love it. That's super helpful. So Matter Labs CEO has said that over 200 projects have registered to deploy on zkSync Era. And I'm curious if you can give us an update on the breadth of the ecosystem and really like which projects are exciting you the most. That there's been all this development. Now, there's some activity to look at. What are you most excited about? What projects do you see that have the most potential in your mind? Anything to do with that?
Absolutely. So we see projects deploying across the board from all of the verticals that people are familiar with, the DeFi, NFT infrastructure, Oracle infrastructure, on-chain gaming, off-chain gaming, the sort of whole nine yards. I think the two types of projects that really excite us are one, it's what I mentioned before, one, the types of projects that uniquely benefit from a cheap execution environment in the sense that they make some design trade-off that it's uneconomic on the layer one, but the second that you move to a layer two, it becomes much more reasonable. The classic example of this was actually the rise of the AMM architecture, right? So if you remember the history of it, it was actually designed because of it would be way too expensive for you to design and update an order book exchange on Ethereum layer one. And so there had to be a compromise. And so the structure of the automated market maker sort of came to be. But then once you move to a much cheaper execution environment with a layer two, then all of a sudden the design space is sort of much more open. Now you can have hybrid exchanges, you can have straight up order books, you can have dark pools, you can have RFQs, you can have all sorts of wonderful primitives that obviously exist in the traditional space and would benefit from having access to global liquidity, but also some sort of guaranteed privacy and also commitments to bids and asks. So having sort of guaranteed execution, guaranteed settlement, these sort of things. That's one type of project. The other types of projects, which really excite me on a personal level, are the ones I said, they enable a cheap execution environment. So the types of projects that leverage, for example, the way that we approach data availability, which we don't post the inputs to the transaction, or the call data is sort of never makes its way to the L1 in its full form. Instead, what we publish is the differential, or the difference between the new state and the old state. What that does is, if you imagine you and I, for some strange reason, I send you $1 and you send it to me back, and we keep doing this sort of 1,000 times. Of course, we would never do that, but imagine we had 1,000 traders doing this. If you were to post the data that corroborates every single transaction, well, then you have 2,000, right? So one for me and one for you. You would have sort of 2,000 pieces of data that you have to store in the L1. Whereas the way we decide to do it is, it makes much more sense to say, well, if you and I just went back and forth, all I really need to do at the end is update the final state between us, who owes who money. If at the end I was the last person to sort of send you money, then I owe you $1 and that's it. That's all the L1 would sort of need to know. So that means you can do a lot of high frequency updates of your Oracle, for example. Suppose that you update your pricing information many times per minute, which is not what you sort of do today, which is why on-chain trading in general is sort of very difficult. You subject yourself to adverse selection when you sort of do that. You can now sort of do this in a way that's trivial because it's no longer expensive. It actually completely closes the loop on the original problem, the AMM problem on the L1. Another example would be how you use snarks in general to enable sort of native layer privacy, which again, it was very difficult to do on the Ethereum L1. These are all what I would term as primitives that enable a very cheap and potentially novel execution environment.
Super interesting. Yeah. So Matter Labs raised a pretty significant ecosystem fund along with their last Series C. Is that right? So I'm curious, as head of investments, that's a lot of capital to deploy. How do you think about deploying capital for Matter Labs, and what's some of your main focus today? Does it tie into some of what you've already shared? Is there more?
Yes, the way we look at capital investments is the same way that we look at investments off our balance sheet to do anything. The majority of our investments so far have been in a tremendous talent that built zkSync Lite in the zkSync era. But we also believe that there exists talent outside of the umbrella of Matter Labs. There's going to build parts of this on top of this technical stack, right? Matter Labs is a finite company with a finite number of people in it, and our community certainly is much larger and much more pervasive. And we hope one day will even much more competent than we are. And so in the same way that we spent the first 4 or 5 years of our journey investing capital into the employees of Matter Labs, now is the time to start investing into outside the community of people that are going to build on what we built so far. That's sort of the way we look at it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, one question that's become kind of a recurring question on this podcast, it's really just asking, if I were to say the future of crypto is blank, how would you, from your vantage point, fill in the blank? Where is crypto going in your view?
That is an extraordinary question because it can go many, many ways. I think I will throw out some conditional statements. The future of crypto is bleak if we don't find a way to exit the circular reasoning that we have so far been plagued with, which is I build a protocol Y so people can leverage it to trade X, Y so they can leverage it to then speculate on Y. This sort of circularity where the majority of value never leaves the crypto ecosystem, where you don't really provide any value beyond speculation, then the future is sort of bleak. If at best you end up digitizing what we already have in the real world, but making it slower and more expensive and less private, then you've basically done nothing at all. The future of crypto is very, very bright. If you fundamentally enable people to do things on chain that they simply could not do off chain. And if you've ever, and I know some of the listeners to the podcast have some heavy traditional finance backgrounds, if you've ever been or heard of how the Treasury of the government of the United States conducts auctions, or how it used to conduct auctions in the past. And if you haven't, maybe you should read up about the history of Lehman Brothers and Solomon Brothers as well. And you can see what their role was in these auctions. You'll realize there are much, much better technological ways in order to perform these auctions and in order for them to be fair, or this idea of credible neutrality. And these that we're talking about, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of transactions. There are ways to implement these features using public blockchains that would actually, not only would it maximize utility, or it would maximize the benefit for all of the participants, it would make it a much more transparent and a much more neutral process as well. And there are countless examples, but these have to be built. And it has to be usability, user experience, cost effectiveness, latency. All of these things have to be at the forefront of the discussion, not the speculative, one day this thing will be a good product is not sold, is how I observe.
Yeah, super interesting. So taking a step back, from your experience and from your vantage point now, I'm curious what advice you would want to either give others, or maybe even thinking back to when you started investing on behalf of Matter Labs, what advice would you give to others or your past self on investing in the crypto and blockchain space? Any lessons that you feel like are, especially salient, or, have stood out as especially important?
Absolutely. The one that always comes to mind, there's no replacement for doing the work. you absolutely have, as a capital allocator, as an investor, you absolutely have to understand what it is that you're investing in. There's just no other way to do it. This idea that one could manage a portfolio of crypto investments without being able to even articulate how something like a basic consensus protocol works, or a hash function, or how the Bitcoin network operates, your ability to inarticulate these concepts immediately disqualifies you from managing other people's money, at least in a serious way, I think. And if the outcome is not apparent in the short run, it will almost certainly be apparent in the long run. And I always tell founders this: good ideas and ultimately great outcomes always start and end with the investors. If the investors are diligent and prudent and sophisticated, you end up financing an enormously useful set of companies. If the investors are not, you end up financing a bubble.
Love it. That's super helpful. Omar, one last question here. What is your team working on right now, and what's the best way for people to follow along on the journey?
Last question first. You can find us all over Twitter, Mata Labs, zkSync Era. I'll post my personals in the show notes. You can find me mostly on Twitter. And then if you DM me, maybe we'll move to Telegram. What we're working on now, we're working on the first set of companies that we've decided to work with as part of the investment program, which will be made public. And we're very excited about teams that are very, very technically competent and highly aligned with both our technical and sort of ideological view of the way crypto networks are ultimately going to be useful. And if you fit that bill, and you can see our philosophy is public and it's all over the internet, if this excites you and you studied our technical architecture and you think that the way we're doing things has a high probability of succeeding, then please reach out to us. There is an abundance of problems to work on and a shortage of talent and discipline. So we really need you to help us sort of build these things.
Amazing. Omar, thank you so much for the time. Fascinating conversation. And I'm really excited for people to get a chance to engage with this. So have a great start to your week here and take care.
Thanks very much. This was great.
Great. Bye-bye.